Okay, so this is Series 2, Episode 4, and a special episode, and I'm really pleased about this because I get to talk about one of my favourite topics, pataphysics. And I'm pleased to be joined by Andrew Hugill, the author of Pataphysics, A Useless Guide, which is perhaps the only non-fiction book I've read 3 times, and back on the podcast for the 100th time, is it the 5th time? Christian Bök, anyway. So hello to you both. Andrew, hello, nice to meet you.
Hello, greetings, nice to meet you too.
And hello everyone, thanks again for having me on the podcast. Anthony, it's always a great pleasure to be able to hang out with you.
Okay, so let's get started because I've got, to be honest, too many questions. I normally have about 8 or 9 topics I like to discuss, and I've managed to put together 42 this time. So this could be a problem. So let's just get started. Pataphysics starts with Jarry. Andrew, if you could start by telling us a bit about that man and Ubu.
Okay, well, Jarry was a short-lived individual, and he was a Parisian writer and poet. One of the things I always admire about him is that he was totally committed to art. You know, he lived his life for art, and so his writing was really everything. But there are many other things to admire about him as well, and some things that are not so admirable, it has to be said. However, pataphysics began as an idea, as a kind of schoolboy joke, really, at the expense of the science teacher in the Lycée de Rennes, and where Jarry was a student, along with some other students. And Jarry, of course, was very intelligent, clever boy who delighted in making fun of his unfortunate teacher, a man named Hébert. And Ubu really came out of that. So it began as a sort of schoolboy prank, I suppose, but there was a puppet theatre created which featured the science teacher as a kind of grotesque marionette, and he was named Hébert. And that transmuted over time into Ubu. I mean, I say transmuted, I think Jarry invented the word Ubu, which is probably one of his greatest contributions to civilization, is that word, because there's something about that word, isn't there? It just resonates still. And anyway, eventually Jarry, who worked as an actor in Paris, wrote the play, and Ubu, and that premiere, the famous premiere, was a scandal at the time, and caused, well, they always say they caused riots. I'm never quite sure what that means, but there was a lot of turbulence, shall we say, in literary Paris, but also amongst the general public, because the play was so different to anything that had been seen, and began with a famously rude word, merdre, which is a kind of distortion of the word merde. So you have the extra R in there, merdre. So first of all, you've got the famous mot de Cambron, merde, which had never been uttered on the stage before. Le mot de Cambron, because General Cambron at Waterloo, surrounded by the English, obviously about to die, uttered this word, and this was considered the only occasion on which it was acceptable to say the word shit, you know. But of course, Jarry being Jarry, this is not just the word shit, it's merdre with an extra R in it, and that extra R really becomes almost an emblem of pataphysics, really. I mean, there's so much more to say about Jarry. We could spend the next hour and a half talking about his life, his personality, his works, and so on. And I'm happy to do that if that's what you want to do. But Jarry himself said that he kind of discovered pataphysics. It wasn't like he invented it. I mean, the word was invented by these schoolboys, including Jarry, but he pointed to what he called the patacessors, the people who preceded him, who were pataphysical themselves, you know. And so I think he rather modestly, in a way, acknowledged that pataphysics exists anyway, kind of independent of him, but it depends on him for us to be able to understand that it's there. So it's quite scientific in that sense. You know, it's like a scientific discovery. So the person who makes the discovery claims the credit for having discovered and elaborates the idea and gives it to us. But it's not for no reason that the great novel is called a neo-scientific novel, and that there is this strong element of science in everything that Jarry does. And I think he's a genuinely cross-disciplinary person. He works across the sciences and the arts. He was keen on mathematics as well as literature and painting and so on. So a fascinating individual who was really represented as kind of nexus of all different kinds of ideas.
Yeah, and this is the difficulty we're going to have, because there is so much to say about so many different aspects of pataphysics, and as you say, the man himself. In fact, doing some research just over the last week, if you look up Jarry on Google or YouTube, there isn't that much about pataphysics. There's a lot about Ubu and about his contribution to theatre. I want to ask a silly question to both of you. Do you have a favourite English translation of Medra? Because I've seen Shitley, Shikt is one.
Well, you see now, I like Terry Hale's translation, which is Fruck. And you see, now there are people who disagree with me about that. Linda Klieger-Stillman, who's a wonderful expert on Jarry and pataphysics, she doesn't like it because it makes it more sexual and less scatological, but I like it because it sits better than just adding an R to the word shit somehow, or adding a ch, to give it, putting that extra letter. I like Fruck, seems, and it's more kind of resonant. So I must say I lean towards Fruck, but it's kind of a mistranslation and doesn't quite represent the word properly. But then what does? What could?
Well, I think I haven't seen this particular translation, I think, represented, but I always imagine that the purpose of that R was to attenuate the monosyllable of merde. You'd say it once very quickly, but now you have this way of rolling the R and extending it, right? That's part of the reason you add that little sound effect, that merde. You get this little, prolonged emphasis that makes it a powerful statement rather than this simple punctuated syllable. And you can, of course, do that by translating it into English by adding a Y to it and saying, shit, like that, right? Like just putting that extra Y in there suddenly makes it the same attenuated sound that is no longer just the punctuated monosyllable. I think that's how I would probably translate it. I'd put a Y right before the I, maybe, to prolong the noise of it in the way that you prolong the noise in French by adding that R. But I think what I like about the suggestion from Andrew is that at least you get to use use that letter R, right, in his option, right? Like you actually get to embody the. I mean, yes, we sacrifice some of the semantics by doing so, but we do retain what we think of as the important feature of that modification, the addition of that R sound. And I think you might then want to find a way to replicate that particularly important noise in English. I mean, there are many solutions to the problem. I suppose they're all unsatisfactory, but I think my preference would be to try and prolong the noise of the word shit by adding that extra vowel, that Y sound in there somewhere.
Yeah, and Fruck just sounds good, doesn't it?
I totally agree with Christian that this is about the sound of the word and the spoken word. This is a word designed to be performed as part of a play, so it's not about the orthography of it. Although the letter R itself then goes on to have a kind of life of its own, because Jarry refers to it specifically in Dr. Faustral as one of the sort of key moments from the equivalent books, as they're called, the pataphysicians' library. Is this letter R stands out on its own. So clearly Jarry had other things going on in his mind than just the sound of the word. But I think for Ubu, in the context of that play, it is about the spoken word. That's what gives it its resonance, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, well, you've anticipated what the direction I wanted to go in, because we'll move away from Ubu. I'm sure we'll get back to Ubu. But the other, to my mind anyway, the other key character in Jarry's literature is Dr. Faustral. And in particular, the book Exploits and Opinions of Dr. Faustral is where you get a lot of, it's where pataphysics is developed beyond a prank or just something there for shock value, and it really becomes this, I don't know if you call it philosophy or pseudo philosophy or a science or the science.
Well, Jarry calls it a science. You know, he uses that word famously. It's the last word of the book, and so he clearly thinks of it as in scientific terms. And but I think he had twin targets really. One was religion and the other was science. You know, and I think he basically just wanted to politely critique, perhaps more negatively attack, the orthodoxies of the day, and he could see that science was becoming, you know, a new orthodoxy. And I mean, he loves science. You know, don't get me wrong, but you know, Dr. Faustral writes a series of telepathic letters, pointing out that, you know, this idea that everything can be counted and measured with numbers fails to take account of the realm in which Faustral exists, which is this beyond the ether, this spiritual dimension, even death. You know, so I think there was in Jarry an active debate going on between the scientific impulse, the religious impulse, and the pataphysical impulse, which is somewhere between the two. One of the definitions of pataphysics, and I'll just quote this and then stop talking, is, you know, pataphysics is to metaphysics as metaphysics is to physics. I'll repeat that. Pataphysics is to metaphysics as metaphysics is to physics. You know, so Jarry's seeing physics in the form of science. He's seeing metaphysics in the form of religion, broadly speaking. Well, the spiritual, the unknown, and then pataphysics as something beyond that, you know, and then pataphysics has an apostrophe before it, which takes you somewhere else again. So there's always that undercutting of anything that looks like too serious or established a position. You know, you're always wrong-footed in pataphysics.
Yeah. This was, by the way, this is one of the inspirations behind the name Penteract Press or Penteract Podcast. We thought of the real world being the world of squares and cubes, and then you've got the tesseract as a sort of a non-existent shape or just a theoretical shape. So we wanted to be beyond that again. So right. There's a pataphysical influence there behind Penteract.
Right, there you go. We're still talking about it after all these years. I mean, that's the amazing thing, is that we're having this conversation, you know, from the mind of this kind of slightly deranged poet. You know, here we are still talking about it, and that is quite incredible to me, because I think there are a lot of other sort of isms in the 20th century that were interesting in their way and probably in some ways more influential at the time, but they've kind of become historical artifacts now, whereas pataphysics still has this capacity to be alive, it seems to me. You know, still has the capacity to surprise you and take you to unexpected places. I should stop talking. Christian, say something.
Well, I would pick up the topic of the definition. Alfred Jarry also describes pataphysics as a science of imaginary solutions. I think that's a very interesting and productive idea. When we see it mobilized in his work, you can see that on the one hand, pataphysics constitutes a critique of scientific certainty, a critique of science. But at the same time, it also constitutes a kind of scientific critique of the poetic, of the metaphorical milieu, that he has the opportunity to criticize the attitudes of his fellow poets, who are probably anti-scientific and anti-rational, while at the same time criticizing the anti-poetic and rational behavior of the scientific mindset. It seems to me that he's proposing that that there's a mutual regime of critique around these ideas, and that the job of pataphysics is to create a space within which both poets and scientists can daydream in a manner which is relatively rigorous, in order to come up with ideas that might otherwise be dismissed out of hand, and yet nevertheless get their moment to be examined. And for this reason, I think if there's an alliance, you know, if there's something that which he was invested, he was invested in the idea that you should make the weaker case stronger. You should find a way to justify the rationale for the anomaly, the exceptional thing, the thing that goes unexplained and might require some analysis in order to account for it. Paradigmatically in the sciences, they look with suspicion upon everything that turns out to be exceptional and anomalous, because of course they put into play alternatives perhaps for scientific explanation. You have to take them into account and consider them with greater concern. And when people have asked me what would constitute a pataphysical speculation, like how would you know you're in the presence of it? I'd say, well, the moment anybody says anything hypothetical with the idea that you're supposed to suspend your disbelief for that period of time, and then just simply rationally, very rigorously figure out the outcome of such a premise. Just simply daydream about a premise and then very rationally and rigorously attempt to explore its implications. So among my favorite kind of pataphysical ideas would be to imagine that if you, of course, drop a slice of buttered toast from a height, we know folklorically it always lands butter side down. And alternatively, of course, when you drop a cat from a height, we always understand that folklorically the cat must land on its feet. So let's imagine that those bits of folklore are in fact laws of physics, that they actually are really true, that they're not simply folklore. Then presumably it would be possible to build a pataphysical machine, an engine that would be a source of perpetual energy simply by tying a piece of buttered toast, butter side out, to the back of a cat and then dropping this complex from a height. It would never land. It would probably spin in space without ever landing. That would be a kind of pataphysical speculation, a whimsical act of speculative stupidity, a hypothetical thing that you would dismiss out of hand as nonsense. But it provides an opportunity to come up with ideas. And I think that pataphysics is a place where ideas just get manufactured in order for us to suspend our disbelief for a little bit and exercise our hypothetical speculative imagination in order to come up with solutions to problems that may not exist. Right?
Years ago, I wrote a poem about Bode's law, which describes the positions of the planets. It was 1800s, was it? Just an empirical equation that would explain the positions of every planet based on the known planets. And then when Uranus was discovered, it was found to fit this rule, Bode's law. When Neptune was discovered, it broke the rule, so they threw the rule out. And I remember writing a poem years ago about how actually maybe it proved that what they thought was a new planet was a mirage. Why not stick with the rule? So that's my imaginary solution. And
there are examples in traditional science where this kind of thing crops up. There's a thing called the American Miscellaneous Society. I don't know if you've heard of this. Very distinguished scientists. They're mostly geologists, oceanographers, those sort of people. This was formed in the 50s, this society. And they devised increasingly sort of bizarre experiments, and then used to award a stuffed albatross to the person who came up with the most interesting idea. And there were things like finding ways to observe the ocean without going to sea, extracting energy from ocean salinity gradients to provide Los Angeles with fresh water from icebergs towed up the Pacific from Antarctica.
Yeah, that sounds like a pataphysical idea to me, like an absolute Rube Goldberg solution to some problem, right? Really overly complicated solution to an otherwise simpler problem.
Exactly. And then what happens is you find that these ideas lead to real things that actually are beneficial. So there was one, they had an idea to drill through the ocean floor into the Earth's mantle. And of course, this is really impossible to do, but they tried to actually do it in 1961. And because of that, what emerged was something called the Deep Sea Drilling Project, which is, according to the people who know about these things, probably the most important and expensively funded and revolutionary earth science program of the second half of the 20th century. So. And that came from this miscellaneous society, So these pataphysical ideas can lead to real-world solutions. I mean, you can say, well, perhaps they lose their pataphysical qualities at that point.
For being useful.
They stop being pataphysical, they become useful, yeah. But the uselessness of pataphysics is this is why I love the idea of the uselessness of it, because it's endlessly on the edge of not being useless. I use it all the time. I mean, it's a kind of way of life, really, for me. It's just part of how I see the world. And when I stumbled across it in my early teens, it became just a sort of comfort, I suppose, about making sense of the world, which basically seems to be nonsensical to me.
Yeah, well, this is good, because I did want to address the idea that pataphysics is somehow anti-science, which it clearly can't be. I mean, the three of us all trust science, we all believe in science, and we're all pataphysicians. And there is something in the idea that it has its own internal logic, even when its premises are completely illogical.
Yeah.
And that also makes me think of, there's something in your book, Andrew, where you say you don't like the idea of people just associating anything wacky or anything that's unusual and weird with pataphysics, because pataphysics is more than that.
Yeah, you know, there is a tendency just to assume that what pataphysics is about is being a bit kind of weird and wacky and different, you know, and it's not as simple as that. It's you've used the word internal logic, you know. I mean, there's rigor in pataphysics. It has that scientific element to it. So you know, giving yourself a kind of veneer of pataphysical quality without actually understanding how to misunderstand pataphysics, because understanding it is basically impossible. That, you know, to me, that's just playing with a sort of a veneer. It's not really engaging with the science, you know. Of course, this is a bit. This in itself is a bit unpataphysical thing to say, because everything is pataphysical in one way or another. So even the stuff that doesn't do it properly ends up doing it properly, if that makes sense. So, you know, it's not like, oh well, it's not like a traditional academic discipline where there's a threshold of rigor that you have to cross to qualify. But on the other hand, I have seen lots of examples of people using it as a sort of buzz phrase without much understanding of what they're referring to, and you know, initially I tend to get excited by that kind of thing, and then I look at it and think, oh, hang on a minute, there's nothing here, you know, it's just they're just using a cool word, basically. Yeah,
I think that happens with the term avant-garde as well.
Yeah, it probably does. I mean, avant-garde's a bit more historic. Well, oh dear, no. Pataphysics is more historical than avant-garde on one level, but of course, to me, avant-garde refers to a kind of a period of time at a certain time, whereas pataphysics is just an idea that has a name that exists always. You know, you'll encounter it. I mean, that society I was describing never used the word pataphysics, and I'm sure they never thought of that. I mean, they wouldn't even have been aware of it, you know. But that sounds pataphysical to me, so I'm going to call it pataphysics. So you can be an unconscious pataphysician. You know, you can do pataphysics without being aware that you're doing it. Whereas
and there's a good solution to this.
To be either avant-garde or not avant-garde, right?
Yeah. There's a good solution to this with pataphysics, which is the use of the apostrophe to denote whether it's conscious physics or unconscious. Yeah. So if you've got the apostrophe, it's because you know.
Yeah. So they say. Yes. And the apostrophe before the word is. I love that because it's a way of trying to exclude itself from the dictionary. You know, there is no word that begins with an apostrophe. So it's what Christian was talking about. It's the anomalous thing. It's a word, but it doesn't fit as a word. And I mean, I've written quite a lot about pataphysics over the years, and editors are constantly correcting my spelling, you know, which is always great fun.
Yeah, I think that you know you're in the presence of something pataphysical when you can see that it's a scientifically informed engagement with the arts, or it's an aesthetically informed engagement with the sciences, that it seems to hover in between these two realms with some ease. And I think that there's an important suspension of disbelief attached to all of it, that you're willing to entertain wacky ideas in a state of suspended credulity. And that this is part of the strength of it. You know, it offers you opportunities to examine ideas that might be dismissed constitutes a kind of lateral thinking where ideas are confronted without much judgment, and they're merely tested for the degree to which they actually generate ideas. I mean, that's what I think the job of a pataphysician is to do, is to kind of be a factory for ideas, to come up with things that constitute sites of continuing engagement. There's something perhaps sophistic in their solecisms, right? That you're thinking out loud purely for the pleasure of thinking. You're entertaining ideas purely for the pleasure of entertaining them, and you try things out in these petri dishes of experimentation, right? As I said, I think it's a place where a scientist can go and daydream a little bit. It's a place where the poet can go and imagine that they're in a literary hothouse, a laboratory for their own practice. That there's a certain experimentation at play within it, a speculative experimentation at play. Try on an idea for size and see what happens. And do so in a manner which is rigorous and procedural and constrained and disciplined, but nevertheless is not invested in it. I think that's the important thing, is that people come away with the take it or leave it kind of attitude towards these ideas.
Yeah, so certainly for me, to find something that seemed to combine art and science, it was just wonderful to discover. And to read Dr. Faustral and see this long prose poem novel end with equations, that was just delightful. So what I want to talk about now is how to be a pataphysician and what the principles are behind pataphysical work. And Andrew, in your book, there's a great section where you outline, I think is it 5 key attributes? I'll go through them. Tell me if I missed one. Antinomy,
yeah.
Anomaly,
yeah.
Syzygy, Kleinerman, and the absolute.
Yes.
Is there one I've missed?
No, I think that's probably
no. I got them all. That sounds pretty complete to me.
I told you I made a lot of notes. Okay.
No, but that accounts for them all. I think that's all the ways in which you can be exceptional, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, let's go through them one by one. So, antinomy. What do we have to say about this? Start with a definition.
Well, this is basically, I mean, Kant identified antinomies. These are things where you have things that are self-contradictory, that in theory cannot simultaneously exist. What pataphysics does is to actually have the two contradictory things exist together simultaneously. This to me provides a lot of energy and dynamism in pataphysics, and for Jarry too. I mean, you know, the figure of the plus and the minus. He imagines a stick that is rotating to create a minus sign and a plus sign and a minus sign and a plus sign, rapid spinning. You know, to me, this is computers. You know, there's a vision of early computer logic there. So,
I would have said Schrodinger's cat in a state
Schrodinger's
of
cat, yeah.
Schrodinger's cat, neither alive nor dead.
Yes.
Can't be both, but somehow seems to be in that suspended state of animation, right, in the box, right?
Yeah.
Well, quantum physics is kind of pataphysical. I mean, everything's pataphysical.
Quantum physics is pataphysics essentially, because it has exactly the same kind of qualities about it.
Sure, it has all of those 5 things attached to it, right? Those 5 traits you've listed, for sure.
And if you look at
the world supplementary to this one.
And if you look at a quantum computer, you know, a quantum computer the essence of it is a chip that is held at as near absolute zero as it's possible to get. And at the moment, all the quantum computer can do is to produce the answer 0 or 1, but you don't know what the answer will be until you actually run the program. I mean, I've had a lot of fun programming a quantum computer. The IBM give you this fantastic interface. It's a bit like writing music. You know, there's a 5-line stave, and you put your different functions, your Hadamard function, and all this on this 5-line stave, and you compose this thing, and then it delivers you the answer 1, or it delivers you the answer 0. And this to me is the antinomy at work. You know, that you've got that state of tension, the impossible coexistence of mutually exclusive entities. And this becomes a kind of literary theme as well for Jarry, so it runs through his work. I mean, even the name Faustral, you've got, that itself is a portmanteau of Dr. Faust with all that knowledge and everything, and a troll, the thing that lives under a bridge in Norway. I mean, we know what trolls are these days, right? And they're not that dissimilar, the internet troll, to that kind of troll, this disgusting creature that comes out and causes mayhem. So that name itself seems to me to contain that idea.
Yeah, it's a very important one, I think, for me anyway, and for what I do, and perhaps for all constraint-based writing. But I try to keep things as simple as possible while doing something very complex, or I try to keep things as complex as possible while doing something that is ostensibly simple.
Yes.
I also like to, I tell avant-gardists that I'm a traditionalist, and I'm a very conservative poet, and I tell traditional poets that I'm very avant-garde. So I like that opposition, and that's probably the main way I use my pataphysics in my writing. Christian, how would you say you use this?
Oh, I don't know if much of my work actually partakes of the antinomy very easily. I mean, nothing's coming to mind off the top of my head that fits within this category very comfortably. Apart from either being a genius or a fraud in the public imagination. I think depending upon your attitudes, I probably polarize opinion among the poets in the world. I'm either a super genius or I'm a super fraud, and there's no truck between them, really. Like there's no way in which I can reconcile those two absolutely polarized attitudes about my.
People thought the same about Jarry.
Sure,
take solace in that.
He was probably more troll than genius, I would suggest. More troll than Faust, but I would prefer to think I'm more Faust than troll. But I don't know, the world might think otherwise.
We'd all like to think that, wouldn't we? But we're probably not.
Yeah, I've written down here the Apollonian and Dionysian. I mean, that's an old concept that sums it up too. In the arts, you have to find the right balance there.
I would say that I'm Apollonian in conception, and then Dionysian in execution. That's the appropriate way to be an artist, is to figure out how to be as disciplined as possible, as rigorous as possible in the creation of the work and in the conception behind the work. And then when you have the opportunity to convince others that it's good, you should be Dionysian. There should be some passion and fire in the presentation of the work. That there should be some celebratory, kind of ritualistic explosiveness to it, right? That it shouldn't simply be a reserved kind of activity. I don't know. Yeah, I would say that constitutes a kind of bias on my own attitudes. I would prefer to think that when I show up, I'm Apollonian in conception, Dionysian in execution.
Yeah, and there's a life-work balance there as well. When I interviewed Samuel Andreev, he talked about how he likes to be very Apollonian in his attitudes in his general life, but so that when he creates, he can be more outrageous. Right. I think I'm the opposite to that. I think my work is quite Apollonian.
Oh, for sure.
My lifestyle is a bit more Dionysian.
But the lifestyle, the capacity for drink, I don't know. That's Dionysian.
Anyway, moving on. Oh, I missed out highbrow, lowbrow. That's an obvious one. An obvious antinomy. Jarry used a lot. I think he was trying to mix those up and confuse those two in people's minds.
Yes. I mean, the thing about Jarry was he liked to play with a lot of historical ideas as well. So alchemy, for example, runs through all his work, but in a very peculiar way. It's a sort of Jarry alchemy. It's not traditional alchemy, but of course, alchemy, the sun and the moon, the bride and the bridegroom, it's full of these pairings of opposites, male and female principles and all that sort of thing, and the conjunction of apparently exclusive opposites. And then Jarry himself wrote that wonderful pair of novels, Messalina and the Supermale, which also seem to embody this. In my mind, at least, they come as a pair. So I think it's kind of a life force with Jarry, this idea. the contradictory nature of things, you know, and that was another definition he gave of pataphysics, is the science of the laws governing contradictions and exceptions, you know. So contradictions in there, it seems to be the essence of this antinomy, this mutually exclusive opposition, you know.
Yeah, and like as I say, it's probably the one that I associate most with. But we have 4 more, so let's go on. We've got Anomaly next. And in fact, in your book, Andrew, there's the first appearance of Christian, where you quote him. So let's see if I can read it in this light. Christian says, "The rule itself is the exception in the pataphysical science that rules out the rule."
Yeah, that's a wonderful way of describing it. And Christian's book is also brilliant, by the way, the Pataphysics, the Poetics of Imaginary Science. And I think that's you know, what we're talking about. And so this idea of a science that rules out the rule, yeah. So the thing that doesn't fit, I mean, we've already mentioned it before, haven't we? Anomaly is quite a well-known idea because of people like Charles Fort and this whole history of, you know, a peculiar, unexplained scientific phenomena, you know. I always remember when I was a kid, it was ball lightning. No one could understand ball lightning, but now people know what that is, you know. That's that kind of lightning that travels along in a almost like tumbleweed, you know. People thought this was some kind of magical thing. Now we understand it, so it's no longer so magical. But there's still lots and lots of unexplained things in science, you know, and these are anomalies. And as Christian said earlier, the conventional science tends not to like them because it wants to understand everything.
There's a logic at play to it. In a world that values conformity and the sameness of things, the sameness of ideas, the moment you start privileging exception, right, the thing that's different, you're indulging in pataphysics. So it's dependent upon a certain kind of context. In a world that values conformity and the sameness of ideas, the difference suddenly becomes an important value. The thing that's different from the rest of our paradigmatic understanding of the world, that anomalous thing, suddenly we pay attention to it, and something that would otherwise go undervalued, or you know, of something that would be relatively easy to dismiss, now becomes the central feature of your scientific understanding. It's something that you're supposed to pay the most attention to, not the thing that you're supposed to, you know, politely ignore, right? It's context dependent though. Like that's the thing. Like what constitutes the exception depends upon the milieu, right? You know, the paradigm that you're functioning within. Right? So I would say it's something like a Nietzschean thing. In a world where people admire conformity, you should be impressed by difference. In a world where people admire the sameness of ideas, you should be impressed by exceptionalism.
But the exceptionalism can take an overtly conformist look. I mean, I think of Eric Satie wearing a sort of accountant's bowler hat and suit every day and carrying an umbrella, you know. And well, Magritte similarly.
Yeah.
And they were supposed to be, you know, these exceptional artists who behaved in eccentric fashion, you know. And this was viewed as eccentric because everybody else was wearing bohemian outfits and, you know, behaving in a thoroughly disreputable manner. Whereas
that's why I say it's context dependent. Like the context for similarity and conformity determines what constitutes the exception. You know? I mean, and believe me, I'm the guy who wears a suit. The conceptuals, we always show up in the Armani suits, right? With the intention, of course, of emulating the likes of an Eric Satie, right? That was what we're about. You know?
Yes, there was something about Paris at that time that had this kind of spirit about, you know, where this kind of conforming nonconformity could find its home, you know. And it stayed with us, I think. That's still, I mean, Christian, there you are doing it. You know, that's another way in which pataphysics is still alive. I have to say, personally, I'm much less interested in pataphysics as a sort of museum piece. You know, I feel it as a living thing. You know, and I'm really interested in the future of pataphysics, not just the past. You know, the historical aspects, of course, are very important. We wouldn't have it without that. But I feel like it's sort of, you know, it's made a journey through time and a geographical journey because it's spread around the world, you know. And so, of course, the context has changed. And So our ideas of it now are probably not exactly what Jarry was driving at, but that doesn't matter because, you know, pataphysics has its own energy.
Mm.
Okay, so moving on to the next one, we've got Syzygy, which is, of course, first and foremost, just a beautiful word, beautiful looking word,
It's very
beautiful
hard
sounding
to say when you've had a few pints of beer, I have to say. But yeah, Syzygy is an astronomical term, really, although it crops up in all sorts of fields, but mainly astronomy. And an eclipse is an example of a Syzygy. This is when elements come into alignment unexpectedly, usually unexpectedly. I mean, of course, we can predict eclipses now, but often you suddenly, you know, things just come into alignment. And Jarry used it in relation to language. You know, he referred to the syzygy of words, and what he meant by that, I think, and Christian will correct me, is the is alignment of meanings. You know, for example, in a pun, where you suddenly have, you know, all these different possible meanings aligning within a single word. You know, but beyond that, it becomes a metaphor for those kind of moments that, you know, the aha moments when you suddenly see something you didn't see before because things have suddenly sort of lined up somehow, and you just think, ah, now I see a connection. It all makes sense, you know.
Well, the syzygy in the astrophysical sense, of course, is an alignment of planets that are generally in conjunction in opposition to each other. They're on opposite sides of their orbital helions, right? And that there's a notion that this conjunction renders these polarities, these opposites, equivalent. I would say that it's a very interesting characterization of the exception, because in a world where, again, equivalences, or excuse me, where differences are privileged, where everything is unalike from each other, the moment when you can find alignments or likenesses between things, all of a sudden they become sources of attention and interest. And the great thing, say, about a pun, of course, is that you have these things that are completely disparate from each other, and you discover a thing that's alike about them. You find an equivalence within them. So in a world where difference is privilege, where we're trying to keep things categorized and separate from each other, where we're trying to place them in polarized opposition with each other, the moment you start finding alignments and equivalences and similarities, that becomes the point of pataphysical attention. So it's kind of the opposite of the anomaly in the sense, like, you know, in a world where equivalence is appreciated, we look for the difference. But in a world where difference is appreciated, then we look for the equivalence. And that's, I think, what Syzygy is about. It's again the kind of, you know, the reversion of that prior principle. They're both aligned with each other. They're kind of in the same spirit, right? You just don't want to be part of the norm. Like that's what makes puns so wonderful, right? Is that they really are an abusive language, aren't they? Like that's you know, like the moment you start finding ways in which you can render things that are different from each other equivalent, right? You know, start asking questions, right? You know, I don't know, how is a raven like a writing desk, right? Like all of a sudden, you know, the answer to that is something akin to a syzygy. You know, you've got these things that there's supposed to be nothing in common with them, and then you find things that are in common with them. You provide equivalences between them. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you've both been talking about your writing because you're both poets. I'm a composer, and you know, I wrote some pieces recently that included one for cello and rook.
Yes, that's a great idea. What an amazing thing to imagine doing.
And this piece it's just fantastic. You know, the rook. Sorry, I shouldn't talk about my own work as it's great.
It sounds fantastic.
I just think I was going to ask you later anyway. So.
I would like to ask how you got the rook involved. Like, where do you get the bird?
It's a marvelous what you can do with a small piece of cheese, but
right.
no, of course it's recordings of a rookery basically, but the combination of the two just works so beautifully. And you would think, you know, that this is impossible. How could these two things work together? I did a lot of my music's like that. So I did another piece, well, more than a decade ago now, for piano and the sound of grinding rocks. You know, rocks being ground together, and piano. You know, again, this combination just somehow works, and it shouldn't do, but it does.
How do you find the pairing? Is it just trying out different things and seeing what works, or is there some logic?
It's some kind of association that I experience. I mean, this podcast is not about me; it's about pataphysics. So I don't want to.
How about your pataphysician?
Whole conversation, but I'm synesthetic, and I have various sort of things that register in my brain, connections that I make, where I hear things differently to other people. You know, and I've done it all my life. I mean, I've got pieces going back to when I was a child, because I started composing very young, that deal with this. You know, these connections that I'm making based on my own kind of inner perceptions. So often they don't mean a lot to other people, but then I start to sort of find ways in which I can communicate what they might mean to other people as well. And I think Jarry did something rather similar. You know, I think he a lot of what goes on in Faustral is stuff that's happening to him in his own life, and we can't really, you know, however much we know about him, we can't get to the bottom of that. But he manages to introduce enough other stuff that is connected to that somehow, that gives readers like us a way in, you know, to his mentality, his world. And I think I'm rather similar compositionally. You know, there's a layer of my pieces that only I will ever understand. Then there are other layers, hopefully, that other people can enter. You know? Yeah.
So I have a question to ask you about that, but I want to get through these last two principles of pataphysics first. So we've got Kleinemann, and I hope I'm saying that right. So I used to say Kleinemann, but I think it's going to be Kleinemann.
Really? Why would it be Kleinemann?
Incline, recline, decline, like all of the, you know, the roots of that word, that radicalisms of it.
I'm not totally convinced, but
yeah, I'm not convinced either. I would say pronounce it as you see fit.
I've always said Kleinemann. But anyway, I mean, this is an ancient idea, you know, from classical Greek philosophy, from Epicurus specifically, and then from Lucretius in his poem De Rerum Naturae, the way things are, or the way the universe is, or whatever. And it's a physical theory, and it's highly pataphysical in the sense that, you know, Epicurus had no evidence base whatsoever, as indeed none of the Greek philosophers did really, for these speculations. But he came up with this idea that the universe is comprised of atoms in a state of continuous descent from an absolute high to an absolute low. So, you know, an unknowable top and an unknowable bottom, and they all follow a parallel course. And every so often, for reasons that we can't understand, and that bit is crucial, you know, the inexplicable change. Every so often, one of them makes a little swerve or deviation in their course, and the result of that is they collide with a neighbouring atom, which then sets up a chain reaction, and you end up with matter. This is how matter is created. You know, this is what we're all made of these chance swerves or biases in the course of atoms. I mean, it's a lovely theory, and actually not that far from what we still believe. You know, like a lot of Greek atomist theories, they're sort of primitive versions of current theory, really. But of course, for Jarry, this becomes a way of changing the direction of things. I mean, think of the word merdre. You know, adding that R is a Kleinemann. Or a Kleinemann. It's adding a letter into a word to change the meaning and resonance of the word. So, you know, you deviate from the predictable path, and it's a way of introducing swerves and deviations into things.
I guess harking again back to that model of context, in a world where we privilege determinism, we pay attention to the whim, right? That there's a notion of something being not subject to a foreordainment of laws and rules that inhabits everything, right? A certain element of chance or randomness that imparts itself upon events, and that it constitutes the smallest difference that makes a difference. Like what happens when you make this very slight little, you know, change, a merest little deviation from the straight and narrow. What ends up happening, right? You know, you spiral out into butterfly effects that lead to hurricanes, right? Like that there's something about the Kleinemann that constitutes that divagation, that smallest little detour. And I think that the reason you imagine that such a thing must exist is that you don't want the world to be inhabited purely by fatedness, where everything is predetermined in advance, that somehow there's a role that pure randomness, that what amounts to a kind of whim in the atom, right? That it has its own whims that are unconstrained by laws, and that's a pataphysical idea. That the importance of whim in the business of thought seems to me a very crucial piece of the climate. And we again, when we point it to in language, we start experimenting with these tiny little particles of letters, and we try to make an important major change in the meaning of a word simply by making this minor adjustment to it, something really small that transforms the entirety of the work itself. Absolutely, results in something big from the smallest possible part.
Yeah, there are several applications to the arts, aren't there? Andrew, I think you mentioned the Situationist data in the morning as an example.
Absolutely, yeah.
And of course, Duchamp would be another example. Recontextualizing something in general is, I guess,
that's one of the ways you do it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. They're making a small adjustment to a given object, transforming it. So you recontextualize it by, in Duchamp's case, showing it in a gallery and making it a work of art. But you change the object itself as well. I mean, the most famous example is drawing a moustache on the Mona Lisa. Which is obviously, I mean, all of Duchamp's work really has that pataphysical quality to it. I think he just so extensively was immersed in pataphysics and those ideas that he becomes a kind of embodiment of that way of thinking. So take any of the ready-mades and you'll see an example of Kleineman going on.
Yeah, and Christian, do you want to talk a bit about how this principle is used in conceptualism, in poetic conceptualism?
Oh, well, most of my friends imagine that they can be writers simply by recopying an already pre-existing text, right? That they're fundamentally stenographers or pirates, they marry stenography with piracy. That they're working in the manner of a medieval scribe, retranscribing work. And that in the very act of doing that, the labor of it, the replacement of the work with these adjustments, you've caused it to be reborn anew into something else, perhaps something stranger, something a little odder. One of my favorite examples of this is my friend Simon Morris, who simply retyped On the Road by Jack Kerouac. He published each page, one a day. He retyped a single page from that novel once a day and posted it to a website, whereupon he then republished the book in a facsimile edition of the original Penguin Classic version of the book, with a prefabricated parodic cover that reproduces the structure of the original cover, a pirated edition, in which he's basically retyped the book. But of course, in reverse order, page by page, in the way you might read it on a blog posting. That changes our understanding of On the Road, right? He's made it his own, I suppose, by doing this rather stupid act of retyping it. And what I think is the marvelous adjustment to it is that one of his friends, Joe Hale, sits down and retypes Simon Morris's version of On the Road, thereby putting it all back in the right order again, and then republishes that as a pirated edition with the facsimile cover and the parodic imagery. So you've got 2 or 3 versions of this prank being conducted, all of which are fundamental detours, right, from the roadmap established in advance for you by Jack Kerouac, right? If you really want to understand Jack Kerouac and get in his head, you probably should retype his words, right? You reread the book and type them all out again in order to learn something about the stylistic sensibilities that inform his own practice. But in the act of doing so, in the act of doing that little act of repetition, noise or a difference gets added to it. Some minor change occurs that teaches you something you didn't otherwise know about the work. That's what I think is an important insight, at least from this strategy in conceptualism, is that even plagiarizing a work, recopying it, continues to add value to it. Surprisingly, you manage to add a small change, a deviation, one minor tiny bias gets altered in the course of this act of repetition that transforms it, turns it into something new, causes it to evolve. And I think this is why copying things is a very important feature of the arts. Like when people say you shouldn't copy anything, I say, no, copying things is the only way by which things evolve, right? I mean, like a change can't occur unless something gets copied, right? If not for the minor mutations and deviations, the Kleineman of genetic copying, right? Nothing changes, nothing evolves. We don't become sophisticated thinking creatures without the benefit of that happenstance occurring over billions of years of reproduction. No, you got to copy stuff in the arts in order for you to be able to produce these slight little deviations that result in, I don't know, the world around us. Like, to me, that's the important thing that you derive from our a permission to use plagiarism as one other tool in the toolbox.
Great. So we're down to the last one, but then I get to turn the page on my notes and we have another hour. So the last one is the absolute. Now, I think this is the hardest one to think of in terms of how it's applied to pataphysical art and pataphysical life. But if anyone can do it, Andrew, you can.
Andrew's going to do it. Andrew can do it.
You're absolutely right. It's the hardest one. I mean, I think it's part of what makes it so hard is that it was very big historically, but has kind of largely fallen out of usage today. This notion of the absolute. So. Hegel, I suppose, is the most famous philosopher who talked about it a lot, you know. And for Jarry, there's a book called L'amour absolu, the absolute love, you know, and there's this idea of the absolute state. And I think I said at the beginning of this that Jarry was somebody who devoted himself to art, to literature, to making his life as beautiful as literature. Which was, one of those little aphorisms that he came up with. And somehow, I think this is an absolute state that he's aspiring to. You know, it's a totality. It's a kind of extreme, but I guess we'd use that word today, but he wouldn't have used that word. But it is a philosophical notion of the absolute, the thing that exists beyond, I suppose. I'm not sure whether that's terribly clear, but that's probably because the concept isn't terribly clear.
Yeah, well, I think it's clear enough. And a lot of the early pataphysicians were also interested in ideas from perhaps theosophy or people like Gurdjieff and Ouspensky.
Yeah.
So there was this mysticism around it.
Yes, that's something that
we have now.
Picked up. People like René Daumal and these kinds of figures who saw in pataphysics a sort of way of changing your life experience and, entering a different kind of existence. Nights of serious drinking and all that kind of thing. And Jarry had that. He used the word eternity to describe it.
That was the word I was going to suggest you resort to, right? That portmanteau. Yeah.
Which kind of actually has several of our ideas in the one word, and it's almost an anagram of your name, Anthony, as well. So
can I get it in there? Yeah. Perhaps.
So ether, the luminiferous ether, which was a theory at the time. These days we'd probably call it dark matter, but the idea that the universe that there was this stuff in the universe which was called ether, and this was a standard scientific theory at the time. Then there's the idea of eternity, the absolute state that goes on forever and is eternal. And then there's the ether that Jarry himself drank, ether from chemical laboratories. So Jarry, who was famously poor for much of his life, did resort to all kinds of ways of getting inebriated, and that included some fairly unpalatable substances that he consumed. But that alcoholic state that goes beyond normal existence, that way of taking you beyond into something absolute. I think that's what we're describing.
Yeah, the absoluteness of vodka, maybe something like that.
Yeah, there you go.
Maybe not ether. Yeah, we don't recommend on this podcast. We don't recommend drinking ether.
He also drank picric acid to get out of being in the army.
Oh yeah, crazy stuff.
Yeah.
There was a notion though that through the practice of pataphysics, you might reach some transcendent state of consciousness, of vision, that would exceed, I don't know, the sublunary experience of the world. You know, that there was some reality that was accessible to us through the entertainment of contradiction and anomaly. These were avenues of investigation that would lead you to something more transcendent, I don't know, an experience that was, you know, larger and more wondrous than the one you currently have. Something that couldn't be dissolved, right? Something that was, in some sense, absolute, right? You just couldn't be turned into a soluble thing, right? It wouldn't disappear. That there was some element of permanence or lastingness to it, because it just seemed to me that the nature of pataphysics is to dissolve ideas, right? That it just shows up and it acts like a little acid on ideas. It attempts to test them, puts them into, you know, states of suspension, and tries to figure out how to, you know, defy them, undermine them, subvert them, right? You know, to deviate from them, right? It offers all of these alternatives to the idea and its dominance. And ideally you do it to find out what's left, right? What gets left over from it. I think that would be the absolute, the thing that's left over from that activity, you know.
That was a great explanation. I think, you know, this litany of philosophical and quasi-philosophical terms gives the impression that pataphysics is a terribly serious thing that involves, you know, we mustn't forget the humor of pataphysics. You know, this is one of the driving forces of it. You know, that it does make you laugh, but occasionally in a kind of out loud way, but most of the time in this sort of subterranean way. And you know, Faustral is set. Faustral and his little merry band travel from Paris to Paris by sea in a sieve, you know, and a bit like the Jumblies, but on land. Except, of course, that what they follow is the trace of the old River Seine, which was still, I mean, dried out, but it's still present in Paris, you know, and so there's this hint of the underlying flow of some kind of subterranean river, and I've always thought this is like the humor of pataphysics. It's just there in everything, you know. It's just this constant serious humor. Is it a joke? Is it not a joke? You'll never have the answer, and as soon as you do have the answer, Schrodinger's cat is dead, you know.
Yeah. That's right. The cat's dead.
And it's another antinomy as well.
Yes, very much.
Another antinomy, because it's you take the serious lightly and the light seriously.
Precisely.
Yeah. So how consciously do you use these principles? Are they just things that you've got used to using in your art, or are you sitting down working thinking, I need to apply a Syzygy here, I need to apply a Kleinerman? I don't know who wants to go first.
I will say no. The ideas themselves are just part of the background radiation of being an artist, I think. I would like to think I don't sit there with a set of precepts in mind that are this programmatic, this predetermined by reading. I would like to think that, in fact, no, I've absorbed them. I've you know, through some osmosis, acquired them, and I hope that they just simply manifest themselves in the act of making things. I think it would be unpataphysical to say, oh, you know, what this work needs is more Kleinerman. This work needs a little more Syzygy. I think that would be weird. Like I just don't think you do that. No, I would look and say, is this work funny enough? Does this work induce a sense of the uncanny and strangeness? Like, is it light enough? To me, the avant-garde suffers from lethal doses of seriousness now. It's truly unpleasant and robbed an egg in its seriousness, you know, its weightiness. You know, there's a lightness that's at play in much of pataphysical activity. I mean, it's certainly substantive. It's got its own profundities. But I don't think it's something programmatic. It's not a cult. It's not something that you adopt, right, as a set of premises that to which you will, you know, abide or follow. It's not supposed to be that, I don't think.
So I have a slightly different answer, which is not to say I'm falling into Christian's trap of of saying, oh, I need a little more Kleinemann here, you know. I wouldn't do that, but I think I could probably say yes to you. So where Christian said no, I'll say yes, and we can disagree or be different, which is very welcome, because you always have to have some point of difference. And I think the reason is that for me personally, pataphysics articulated something as a teenager that I still engaged with and still find relevant. And what it did was to give me the language and the understanding to explain my difference, you know. And what I now know since 2018 is that I'm autistic. And I was diagnosed autistic in 2018, so at the age of 60, you know, I find that out. And now I look back at my life and I understand why pataphysics was one of the few things that actually seemed to make sense to me, you know, because you know, the autistic experience of the world is very different. You know, sensory issues, social interactions, and so on. There's a very big difference in the way we experience the world. So I do find myself thinking when I'm working about pataphysics, and usually the decisions I have to make are about how much pataphysics to involve in the sense of being overt or covert. That's all. So it's like, you know, am I going to make this a work where it's obvious that I'm trying to, you know, I'm dealing with pataphysical ideas, even if I don't mention what those are, like wouldn't, or do I actually, you know, conceal the presence of those ideas? So I mean, we were talking earlier about the Rook and cello piece, you know, and that's an example really. I mean, for when I play that to people who know nothing about any of this, they just say, well, that's a lovely piece, you know, beautiful cello melody, lovely relaxing Rook sounds, combination works really well, it's beautiful, you know. And yet what I know is there's this whole other thing going on underneath that gets really, really personal, you know, that actually no one needs to know. And then there's another layer that is less personal, but is of interest, you know, like the way I organise the pitches in the piece, the way that the sections work, and so on. That is something that we can talk about. That definitely has a pataphysical dimension to it. And in the right circumstances, with the right people, I will talk about the pataphysics of the piece, but I won't always talk about it, you know. So it's always there. It's a kind of frame that I use. It's just a way of seeing the world, but the amount of it varies depending on the situation.
Yeah, my own answer would be, and I hinted at this before, would be at the level of coming up with an idea of what to do. I might try to find two things that are in opposition and jam them together. So a topic and a constraint I can put together and see if something works. But then in the act of creation, I don't really use these. I don't use Kleinemann in the Oulipian sense. I rarely would do that, would deviate from a constraint. I think, Christian, that's true of you as well.
Yeah, I don't typically willfully deviate from the constraint, the procedural constraint, if granted. There are certain kinds of homages you pay to that, though. I mean, when writing Eunoia, I wanted to make sure that there was at least a Kleinemann, a deviation from the constraint, but it appears in such a kind of pointless spot in the book that you wouldn't notice it. It's not something that is necessary. It's just there simply to fulfill that function of the little flaw, the little change that is breaking from the predetermined and procedural character of the rule that you followed. It's just a way of saying I'm still free. I don't have to obey the rule, right? In the course of being the artist. But the fact is that most artists are unwilling to obey rules anyway. Like, to me, it's admirable to simply follow through on the constraint without trying to find cause to get out from under it. Like, I think, the harder it is, the better. Like, there's a certain athleticism and virtuosity at play in a lot of that work. Certainly in your own practice, Anthony, I find the wizardry of it, the witchcraft of it, disturbing. Distressing.
That's the idea.
Well, I did consider setting some of your poems to music at one point, Anthony, and I
Oh,
haven't.
wow, you've got to do it now. You've said that. You've got to do it now.
And I just thought about, translating some of those constraints into musical terms. But this discussion reminds me of there was a piece I wrote in 1980 called "Bride Teeming with Sweet to the Bridegroom," which is actually 2 bits of Sappho fragments and just buttered together. And it has 2 little phrases of music. And all that happens in the piece is that the 2 phrases are rather similar, but not quite the same. And in the piece, 1 phrase repeats, and and it's followed by silence. And then gradually 1 note from the 2nd phrase comes in, and 1 note is lost from the 1st phrase. And it walks through until you hear the 2nd
great,
phrase.
Andrew. That's a great idea.
I
really love that idea. That's a fantastically good idea for a composition.
Oh, thank you.
Well, that's a very smart thing to do. Oh, geez, I'm envious of that idea. That's a very good idea.
Right. Well, okay. Well, the thing about the reason it reminds me of that particularly is that when I copied that piece out for publication, because it was published in '83, I think, I made a mistake in the copying out. And so the system that I use, by which 1 note is dropped and another one is added, actually breaks down briefly in the middle. There's 1 bar where there's a wrong note, in effect, in the bar. But of course, when you listen to it, you have no idea that's. I mean, you wouldn't detect this in a million years, And then, having got that to the proof stage, I then went through this agony of indecision about whether to correct my mistake.
Did you correct it?
I did not.
Oh, I see. I would have corrected that. I would have thought,
yeah,
I have a chance to fix this.
In the end, I decided that it would be better to let that piece of chance Kleinemann or Klineman operate in the piece and keep it a secret.
I applaud your willingness to do that. I really do. I think that I know I could not do that. You call yourself autistic. I say no.
Well, the funny thing is that everything went incredibly well until it was 2015, I think it was, when some guy in France wrote to me and said, your piece "Bride Teeming Sweet to the Bridegroom" is great, and I've used it with my students, and we analysed it in class. Do you realise there's a mistake?
A mistake in it. Yeah, of course. That's what somebody's going to say, right? It's exactly what somebody's going to say. Do you realize there's a mistake? And you have to kind of gamefully say, yeah, of course. It's actually intentional, right?
Yeah, there's always someone who pops up to say.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of flawed, So I thank you for your compliments, but the actual piece is a kind of flawed piece. But I quite like the fact that it's got this anomalous element in it that you can't tell is there, because you would never notice it when you listen to it. And it's just having that's what keeps that piece alive for me, because most of the music I write I end up throwing away, but that piece I've kept because of that, and it's got this thing in it that I know isn't right, and it really tears at me.
Well, in living things, that would be the slight mutation that provides an occasion for some future change, that adapts that work and makes it more sophisticated. Like somebody's going to think about that and respond to it, copy it in a manner which adjusts to it. Like to me, it's the little anomaly is going to be an occasion for future conversation, right? It's going to be a point of important attention, right? When people think about that work, right? Apart from, saying, fix it, right?
But you know what, because I also write music, and I think I'd be more willing to allow that in music than in a piece of literature. I've been trying to figure out why that is.
Is a mistake in the performance of a piece of music more forgiven than it is in a work of literature? I mean, like a spelling error is noticeable and a source of consternation, but a drop note in a concerto is not. I don't know. I mean,
not as much as a spelling mistake.
It seems to me there's a lot of perfectionism in both disciplines, right? Like
there is. I think there is a level with music where drop notes are not a problem. And there are many famous pianists whose recordings contain mistakes, but they're still great performances. So there's that sense that you can sort of get away with certain things in some ways with music.
Yeah, I think that's it.
And I mean, you know, it's like the difference between Schoenberg and Webern, really, isn't it? I mean, in Webern, there's absolute precision. In Schoenberg, there's an element of, shall we say, fluidity with the system that he used, or indeed Berg, you know, where there's actual romantic expression, you know, choosing tone rows that result in certain pleasing triads and all that kind of thing, you know.
Yeah.
It depends on the situation and the music, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, but when you go to see a rock band, for example, you don't want it to sound exactly the way it does on the CD. You want it to, or the tape or whatever medium. You want it to, you want a few mistakes or a few things that are just a bit off, because that's what gives it character.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say that. You see, I'm not so sure that's true in every case. I think it is in some, but I think there are a lot of people go to rock concerts wanting to hear the album and get frustrated if they don't hear the album, you know. And I've not been to many rock concerts in recent years because my hearing's so bad. Well, actually, I've not been to many rock concerts full stop, but I talk to people who go, and that's the kind of thing they say, you know. And I get the impression that people do want to hear something that resembles what they're already familiar with. Isn't that the point of a lot of popular music, is to give people what they want? You know,
do we go to the movies to see the book writ large on the screen, and as a consequence feel disappointed?
Some people do.
Yeah, I know if you're listening to the Goldberg Variations, you know, by Johann Bach, and you're like expecting metaphysical and mathematical precision, right, in its performance, because of course it's a highly complex, beautiful mathematical structure, and then you listen to, well, I don't know, maybe one of the greatest pianists ever playing it, Glenn Gould, humming along and making mistakes. Are you going to feel satisfied? I don't know. Like, but you certainly have a insight into Glenn Gould, right? In the course,
a lot of people can't stand that, you know, and but they also consider Gould's interpretations to be overly mannered and so on. But
sure.
But then you listen to it and you think this is just magnificent playing. So
absolutely, that's just it. It's like the moment something performed like that again, right? Those infelicities that are added as a side effect of its reproduction, of its copying, in this particular case, added unexpected value to it. They suddenly, you know, inform its character. I think that's why people go to see, I don't know, the certain performances of rock music. I don't know, you go to the Grateful Dead, not because you want to hear the album, right? The album is, in fact, I don't know, some distributed object that is handed around on cassette tapes, right? You know, from performance to performance, right? There is no such thing as an authoritative rendering of those works, right? There's none that we can count on and say that's the performance that matters, right? When you go to a Grateful Dead concert, you're just hanging out to hear the music in its moment of production, you know, in that one instant. And it's not, I don't know, maybe the live performance of music is supposed to do that for you, right? You know, with all of its happenstances, right? With all of the drop notes, I don't know, the errors of transcription that you've just recorded, like that one little mistake in your thing that has kind of tarnished or damaged, right? The purity of the actual imagined work. Right?
Yeah. Well, actually, while we're talking about music, I'm going to go slightly off script and we'll jump ahead. Let's talk about pataphysical music, because there's some examples, Andrew, that you mentioned in your book. Obviously, we mentioned Erik Satie already.
Yeah.
After Jarry, I think I put him second as the iconic pataphysician.
Yes, I mean, sans le savoir. I mean, you know, it wasn't a word he used, but it's clearly there. And another autistic artist, I have to say, you know, quite clearly. But yes, I mean, so his ability to rethink the way you understand formal construction, the way that music exists in time or through time, that was truly groundbreaking, and that's why, you know, he's still so influential today. I mean, people forget the Gymnopédie, which is the famous work, you know, it isn't one piece, it's three pieces. And what you hear in those three pieces is the same idea examined from three different points of view. You know, I think this was genuinely new. Likewise, on track cinématographique, where that was a film score, and he's working with the durations of the shots in the movie. So you know, I mean, that's standard practice now, but at the time that was completely new. You know, you didn't do that. You wrote music that
the notion of furniture music that is supposed to be in the background, that you don't have to sit down and pay attention to. There's no such music, not even like in chamber music, right? Everybody has to pay attention to the music when it's being played. There's no notion that music is ambiance, right? Yeah. Music as music, right?
Of course, now, I mean, this is such a common idea, we all hate it, but at the time, I mean, very new. So I think, but also his writings, you know, Memoirs of an Amnesiac. I mean, there's a great title. You know, and the drawings as well. You know, some of these incredible. There it is. Yeah, some of these incredible drawings of towers and the fantastic calligraphy, and I don't know. He was an all-round multimedia artist, I think, and people tend to forget that. They think of him as just the composer of the Gymnopédie. It's a bit like Jarry. They think of him only as the author of Ubu. You know, and it turns out there's so much more. And it's the same with Satie. So
the scores themselves, right? I mean, they don't just have this audiophonic dimension to them, but when you look at them, they're visually appealing images, right? You know, a score about waterfalls, music that's inspired by waterfalls. The score looks like a waterfall, right? You have the beautiful directions, of course, to the music. Something that John Cage, of course, noted at great length, with much affection and interest, right? You know, you're supposed to play the music on the tips of your back teeth, play the music as though a monkey is watching. I mean, stuff that you there's obviously an invitation to be, you know, interpretive and imaginative, to really be pataphysical in your understanding about how to play the music. It's not, you know, play this music, you know, legato or something. It's like, you know, play it on the tips of your back teeth.
The humor's there again, isn't it? You know, like a nightingale with toothache.
Yeah, play it as like a nightingale with a toothache. I mean, like, what the hell is that supposed to be, right? But to me, look and say that's permission, right? Like all of a sudden it's no longer programmatic, right? You're supposed to now indulge in an element of interpretive response to the work, and then of course when that work is likewise a visual poem, right? It's actually got this dimension that only the performer can see because it's on the page in front of them. Like having stuff like that inbuilt into the score strikes me as innovative. Like, you know, I mean, now we might take it perfectly for granted that there's lots of, you know, scores that have this visual component to them that are, you know, a delight to look at, right? Not just to play or hear. To me, that's a very unusual shift, right, in the attitudes towards musical composition.
Cage kind of inherited a lot of that through Duchamp, I think. Got familiar that way. But he does also connect with Alphonse Allais, who's another name we haven't mentioned. Fantastic humorous writer, but also the creator of single monochrome canvases, you know, and a silent piece called Funeral March for the Funeral March for the Obsequies of a Large Deaf Man. And what it is a single sheet of empty manuscript paper. So it's a silent piece, and of course there's a joke in the title, like in all his titles. What was the entirely white canvas is entitled "Anemic Young Girls Taking Their First Communion in the Snow." So he was a humorist essentially, but again, way ahead of his time. And I think Cage connects with that spirit at least, and probably knew the work. I mean, it's always a little unsure with Cage exactly how much of the stuff he knew, but there was that link, I think, with that came through Duchamp, surely.
Yeah. So looking at popular music, you mentioned Frank Zappa.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the Beatles with the Maxwell Silver Hammer.
Yes.
Which, the best thing about that is that it's one of Paul McCartney's really family-friendly musical numbers. It's not. It's not. It's not one of the Beatles that are the most avant-garde, and yet that's the opportunity he chose to mention pataphysics.
Well, it just rhymed, didn't it? The Scout was right. Joan was quizzical, studied pataphysical science in the home. I mean, it just trips off the tongue. It's a great line. The silver hammer, I always thought of being rather like Ubu's debraining. You know, it's the silver hammer comes down on your head and crushes you until you're dead, or something like that. You know. So he was very excited by Ubu. He heard a version of Ubu on the radio and was tremendously inspired by it. And I think the other Beatles tolerated it because he was Paul McCartney, but they hated the song. You know, I was reading something the other day where they were complaining about the recording session and how awful it was.
You can watch them record it on the documentary that has just been released. You know, 9 hours in which we actually part of it watched them attempt to bring that song to life, and it's evident that it is not going well, that they really are not inspired by that piece of music. They don't really want to invest in it, that they're irritated by it, but they go along with it because Paul McCartney's a tyrant. He's like, force them to do it, make him do it. Hey, maybe it's not a great piece of music in the entire repertoire of the Beatles, but it stands out for the fact that at that moment that they're actually participating in high art, right? That they actually are very cognizant of the predecessors, that they're not simply making popular music just to be famous, but they're in fact hoping to aspire to make a contribution to the arts. You know, of course they have, right? I mean, they're one of the greatest musicians who've ever lived, right? The greatest songwriters who've ever lived. I encourage you to watch that episode. It's an amazingly stressful, activity for me to watch them create things. As an artist, watching them do it, I've just felt an immense amount of anxiety because it's too true. It feels too close to.
See, I loved it. I loved even the boring bits. I liked.
Oh, of course, I loved every part of it. I mean, but I must admit, I felt anxious watching it because I understood that you're gaining some insight into the weirdness of the creative process and just how troubled it is, how difficult it is, how hampered it is, and that we forget that the things that we create don't want to be born, right? They have to be dragged into the world. There's something in the nature of the pataphysics that shows you that the improbability of things being created, they're really dragged into the world against their will. They're not showing up, welcome. They really are. So, come kicking and screaming. All the good ideas come kicking and screaming into the world. Yeah.
I'd love to talk about music for longer, but the list is here, and there's still a lot on it. Okay, so from music, let's go to film and TV. And the obvious place to start is it's going to be the Marx Brothers, yes?
Probably. I mean, they were members of the Collège de Pataphysique. We haven't mentioned the college at all so far.
It's on the list. We'll get there.
I mean, it had an important role post-war in all of this, particularly in the sense that it published Jarry's work at a time when really nothing was known. I mean, apart from Ubu. I mean, there were a few people who were aware of other stuff, but mostly it was little known. But also there was this sense of this group of people who had this connection because of what Jarry represented, and post-war this was very important, and indeed during the war as well. But the Marx Brothers, so they joined this college and seem to have taken a fairly active part in it. To me, the mirror scene in Duck Soup is a visual demonstration of pataphysics. I mean, that is, I mean, it's an old clown routine, really, but somehow the three of them become the physics, the metaphysics, and the pataphysics. And then right at the end, you get the apostrophe when it all breaks down, and suddenly you go beyond every joke, and then it cuts to the next scene. So that scene alone, but there are specific references. I mean, Harper appears at one point with spiral eyes, eyes whizzing round. There are other references, overt references to pataphysics in their work. So yeah, I think the connection's pretty clear.
Yeah, and you mentioned some modern potentially pataphysical films like Donnie Darko. I think is one of them.
Yes. Now you see, this is a bit more difficult because there's always this issue, and we've kind of touched on it in this discussion, about whether people acknowledge pataphysics or not. And I think for a lot of artists who are aware of pataphysics, it's better not to, because you've got a whole set of associations then, and it raises a whole set of issues. What is pataphysics, and why do we have to bother with this French nonsense? And so you can use the ideas without actually ever acknowledging it. But when I watch a film like Donnie Darko, it's pretty clear to me that there's an awful lot of knowledge going on in that film. Studies of how to make a time machine, which seem to directly reference Jarry, for example.
Yeah, there's Being John Malkovich, which I don't think you mentioned.
Yes,
I think there's some nods to pataphysics there. The fact that he lives on floor 9.5.
Yes, I didn't mention that in the book. In fact, I've had various people write to me since the book was published saying, "Oh, you didn't discuss this or that." It's not intended to be a comprehensive survey of everything pataphysical, because that would be
everything.
A task. So yeah, that Being John Malkovich was one that I didn't include. I can't remember why now, but of course it's very clearly a pataphysical film and references Jarry. Yeah.
I was going to point you to the Monty Python's, right? The Flying Circus is thoroughly informed by Alfred Jarry, right? It's not just the Marx Brothers. I think you actually see the kind of gouderie of stupidity, of Jarry-esque stupidity in Monty Python. That's where you find that kind of humor writ large. All of the solecism of that work, all the nonsense, is thoroughly informed by jokes that only philosophers are going to get, right? Jokes that only scientists are going to get, right? They're all silliness informed by their training in the history of ideas. Yeah.
Okay, should we move on?
Science fiction.
Science fiction.
Try and keep us on track.
I'm losing track, but we'll get there. So yeah, science fiction. It could be argued that science fiction is pataphysics. I mean, it's in the same world, isn't it?
It's in the name of science fiction. It's in the name of the genre, right? It links together two incompatible ideas. Fiction is everything science is not, and science is everything that fiction is not. And it seems to me that that's what pataphysics does, is it conjoins these two things that are opposites of each other, right? The true and the false, right? They're aligned with each other and juxtaposed and kind of yoked with each other and inextricably.
So it might be better to ask what the difference is really between the two things. Mm-hmm. But we have there's one great example, and Andrew, you mentioned this in your book, Philip K. Dick, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, where it's really obvious. It's not a subtle hint when there's a hoax religion and it's created by someone called Al Jarry.
Yes.
So we can be safe that that is an intentional reference.
Yes. I think so. But there are many other examples. Some overt, some covert, but it's just riddled with it. So it's hard to know where to begin with science fiction. There's so much of it that clearly references pataphysics and is aware of that. Yeah. Pataphysics
begins at the same time as H.G. Wells is writing The Time Machine, right? That it's evident that Alfred Jarry understands the context within which that idea gets manifest in his own work, right? He writes about time machines at the same time H.G. Wells does. There's a great deal of confluence, I think, between the notion of scientific romances and pataphysics from that period. It's probably just part of the zeitgeist, really, that those two things would be occurring at the same time. Just that one's whimsical, one's not, like maybe science fiction is just serious and substantive. By comparison, pataphysics is light and dismissive and whimsical by comparison. Science fiction plus humor, science fiction plus talking baboons, like something like that.
He was friends with Pavlovsky, the author of Voyage to the Fourth Dimension, and this notion of time as the fourth dimension that was around, well, still is around, but was around very much. But I think his frustration with H.G. Wells was that he described the time machine but didn't tell you how you could actually build one.
Yeah.
So he creates a manual for how to construct a time machine, complete with all the engineering, all the equations and everything. And I mean, it's much later, like I think in the 70s, when a musician, I think it was Robert Calvert, pointed out that what he was describing was actually a bicycle. His own bicycle, you know.
That's right.
If you read it in a certain way, you understand that this is just a description of a bicycle. But
that's right.
The text is written in such a way that it appears to be an actual machine, you know, with these held in immobility. You have to be immobile in space in order to travel through time. There's a hint of Bergson there as well, and to go back to philosophy. And Jarry, of course, studied with Bergson. You know, was a keen student of his notions of duration and élan vital. You know, this idea of life in everything. You know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think again of the quantum computer. You know, the frozen heart of the quantum computer, and it's frozen because that's the only state in which these quantum particles can continue their energy. You know, this idea of the frozen state of being and existence. You know, Jarry actually wrote about this, comparing, you know, the business of existence and the business of being alive, and seeing one as a frozen solid state and the other as a vital, energetic state. You know, another antinomy, really.
And another thing you've just mentioned, and reminds me, we haven't talked about it yet, is Jarry's obsession with bicycles, which leads to things like the Passion of the Christ considered as an uphill bike race, and
yes,
the gid wheel as well. Which another thing we haven't mentioned, which goes to show that even though we've talked about a lot, there is a lot to this topic. So let's go from science fiction to other literature.
Yeah.
Because I really like to talk about Borges, because I always do like to talk about him. And I'm going to mispronounce this because I always do. Toulon Ukba Orbis Tertius. How did I do?
Christian.
Okay. Sounds good to me.
Favorite topic.
So this is this is an imaginary society that Borges writes. Well, he writes about other people writing about it. A group of intellectuals have come together to create an imaginary world. So I mean, is he talking about the College of Pataphysics?
So, certainly something akin to it, because the irony in that story is that the imaginary world, you know, fabricated by these intellectuals, begins to vaporize ordinary reality, right, and replace it. Like this thing that's supplementary to it eventually substitutes itself for it, until you can't tell it's not real anymore. It becomes reality. It's a great premise for the idea of Jean Baudrillard about the simulacrum, right? That the thing that is used as a means of representing something eventually supplants the thing that it represents and replaces it, and is indistinguishable from it, right? That there's no way to actually parse the two. I think the story that he describes there is a kind of pataphysical nightmare. It's like it's a whimsical story about how, you know, an idea can go completely awry and take over the world, right? Disappear into the world itself, and like just transform things so utterly that you can't tell the difference between it and the real world anymore. There's an impulse like that in pataphysics, right? You know, that the idea is sovereign, not the real.
Yeah, Andrew, anything to add? Because of course this is in your book as well.
Yes, I'm not sure I've got a lot to add to that. There's such a brilliant summary of it. But I mean, there are other things in Borges that connect. Pierre Menard, the author of Don Quixote, we've kind of touched on this with you know, the person who rewrites word for word Don Quixote, and then that brilliant analysis of it that shows that although the words are identical, the context has completely changed, so their meaning has changed. You know, and that I think is crucial. And of course, the Library of Babel as well, which you know, the chance combinations, the sort of randomization of every possible word, leading to these syzygies where things come together, and presumably you find the works of Shakespeare. You know, eventually, after 10 squillion lifetimes and going completely mad, you do find something, some meaning. So. Yeah, the parallels are there. And of course, there was this character, Jesus Borrego Gil, or however you pronounce it, who wrote for the College de Pataphysique journal. and man of mystery, but his name is an anagram of Jorge Luis Borges.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Never quite sure how to pronounce that name. But...
Well, certainly the stories by Borges, Pierre Maynard and the Library of Babel are instantly canonical to my gang of peers among the conceptualists. We regard these particular stories as talismanic ways of thinking about what we do. And it makes me wonder, of course, to the degree to which Borges would have been welcome in the Collège de Pataphysique as a member. It just seems to me that those stories are very pataphysical. They pretend to be true in a manner which is just convincing enough to be on the verge of verifiability. There's something about the pataphysical mindset that I think aspires to be just at the verge of verifiability. You can't tell whether it's true or not. There's a truthiness to it.
And it's sort of slightly uneasy relationship with academia, you know. So
sure, there's an uncanniness at play in all of that, right?
Yeah.
You can't tell, and you're a little disturbed because when you start looking at it, when you start, you know, doing the research, it seems plausible. There are many clues that this is all, of course, you know, derived from things that exist, and they're just combined in such a way as to strain credulity just enough for you to be sown with doubt. And yet, you know, one of the things I like about reading Borges is that the ideas just seem so neutral and plausible, but they're fake, they're false, they're not real, right? You know, if you mention a book like the use of mirrors in the game of chess, a great title for a book, right? Mentioned in one of the stories by Borges, and people will go to the trouble to find out whether or not this book exists because it just seems like such a great idea for a book, right? Like it should exist, even if it doesn't. It should, and of course, it will be summoned into existence eventually. Some guy will write the book that's got that title.
Yeah, well, this is the idea of the universe supplementary to this one, or the universe is supplementary to this one, which is why I think a lot of the great pataphysical writers were obsessed with creating their own worlds. Another person is very similar to Borges is Calvino, who has the more tangible link to the College of Pataphysics. I mean, Invisible Cities, which Christian, you and I have been talking about that book lately.
Oh yes,
that's a very pataphysical work.
Absolutely. There's something about pataphysics that I think summons itself into existence. Like, you know, it comes up with an idea, it comes up with something that's supposed to be fantasy and speculative, and the consequence of which is that it, like the world of Talon Orbis Tertius, you know, just shows up, right? It suddenly becomes the nature. It's the logic of the supplement described by Jacques Derrida. You know, like things don't just supplement something; they aspire to supplant it, right? The thing that is there to be additive eventually just becomes. It's no longer augmentative; it's substitutive. You know, like the world gets gradually replaced, right, by this fantasy world. You can see intimations of this in modern life, right? In the way in which, you know, a fantasy world begins to supplant the real world. I don't know. I mean, you know, certainly the political environments that we inhabit, but I think even the literary environments or the aesthetic environments, right? There's, you know, like there's an entire generation of people who interpret the world through the prism of Harry Potter, if not Star Wars. Like those worlds are real, right? Like,
It's true. I've got in my notes here, I've got fake news as one point to talk about. We'll get onto that. Another book I just thought of, the Codex Seraphinianus.
Yes.
Get that right? Codex Seraphinianus. I mean, that's.
Do you have a copy of this book, Andrew? The Codex Seraphinianus?
I have a digital copy, not a physical copy, which is I should have a physical copy.
My most favorite books. Love this book immensely. It's
I've got one just there, but it's just out of reach.
Right.
Yeah.
I must add it to my collection. It's a wonderful book. I know. I've admired it for quite a while. Yeah.
So yeah, a book that it's a book that comes from another reality.
Yeah, it's a very convincing encyclopedia, right? It's an encyclopedic text written in an alien language that really apparently has an enciphered meaning. Alas, the only thing that's been deciphered is the pagination, but apparently the entire book actually has something to say. It's just in an indecipherable code that has so far not been cracked. And yet it's a haunting, whimsical, strange book. really, it's one of my favorite things I've ever seen in, you know, libraries anywhere. I think it's really a remarkable achievement to write a fantastic encyclopedia. It is certainly inspired by Borges's Talon Orbis Tertius for sure, right? It's got that kind of magic attached to it, you know, an imaginary world that somehow seems ready to supplant our own, right? It comes fully clothed, ready to go, ready to be unpacked, you know. It's a wonderful thing, you know, absolutely pataphysical encyclopedia.
Yeah.
So is there anything else about art that is either definitely inspired by pataphysics or potentially inspired by pataphysics? Is there anything else that you two would like to bring up?
Roussel, and I think we probably should. You know, it's an interesting question whether Roussel actually knew, or certainly his personal position was that he had nothing to do with the avant-garde, had no interest in it. And yet, of course, we know that the surrealists were largely responsible for what reputation he had in his lifetime, and then we know that he had copies of Jarry's books. So there is some evidence that he was aware of pataphysics, at least as maybe not the word, but the concepts that were in it. But I mean, his work.
He aspired also to be Jules Verne, didn't he? Right? He thought Jules Verne was the greatest writer alive, right? And certainly Jules Verne is endeared to pataphysics, right? You know, the science fiction novels, scientific romances. I mean, as far as Raymond Roussel was concerned, Jules Verne was the greatest writer who ever lived, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Roussel aspired to be the kind of popular writer, but somehow couldn't do it. You know,
there's no way you could aspire to be a popular writer writing those absolutely super crystalline sentences and with these bizarre, you know, formal constraints. Absolutely impossible to imagine that you could be such a popular writer writing according to such deranged premises of writing.
So one of my favorite things is the note he attached to the edition of Impression d'Afrique, which begins, readers unfamiliar with the works of Raymond Roussel are advised to start this book on page 250. The story begins halfway through the book. And of course, but what I love about that is that nobody would have been familiar with the works of Raymond Roussel.
Yes.
You know, it's just, he was completely, you know, people didn't read his work at all. So it was that kind of, you know, his sense of his own genius and the sense of his own importance that completely was not aligned with any kind of reality, really, you know. And then thinking that those plays that he wrote would be popular theatre, you know, and then and turning up every night to watch the same performance, you know, watching little variations in the actor's performance and giving them notes. And then wondering why people were throwing things at the stage and booing and all this kind of thing, you know, utterly baffled and crushed by that. He's an extraordinary figure, and I think a real a different kind of pataphysician, I would say, to Jarry, you know, where it's much harder to penetrate what's going on with Roussel because everything is just layers of clues, isn't it? But there's something.
I will say to you, Andrew, aspirationally, if I could write a book as cool as anything that Raymond Roussel has written, I would feel like I had accomplished an immense amount in the course of my career. I don't think I've written any book that is as gorgeous and as strange or as weird as anything he's done. And you know, I just regard him as an absolute limit case, right, in the history of writing. There's nobody like him at all.
No, indeed, he's quite unique. So, you know, exceptional. Yeah, so clearly pataphysical. Sorry, I had to put him in Antony because I thought, you know,
no, good call.
Him out, and you can't.
That's a very good call.
Yeah.
So all we have to do now is the past, present, and future of pataphysics.
Oh, well, that's easy.
Yeah. I want to talk about the college, of course. We've got to get the college in properly. So,
well, I mean, the world's full of pataphysical organisations now. You know, so there's the college itself, which it continues to do its thing one way or another. And then there are many other organizations. Some, are groups of people, some are just one person. And indeed, the college itself really started as one person, with multiple identities. And animals. I mean, the thing I love about, many things I love about the College of Pataphysics is the fact that the animals in the college had exactly the same status as the humans. So among the founders of the college were a Matamata turtle and a crocodile, and the crocodile subsequently became the head of the college and made all the decisions, So this to me is something we can learn about organizations. That just because we're humans and we think we're clever doesn't actually mean we have the answer to everything. And I think other entities, other creatures need to be included in our decision making.
A crocodile in charge.
Put a crocodile in charge. Well, at least the crocodile, whose name was Lutembi, dispensed justice. Basically, you were taken to see him, and if he ate you, you were guilty. And if he didn't, you were innocent, So it's really, it's quite clear cut. It's true or false, And then, of course, there's Bostonnage, who we haven't mentioned, but and the eternal refrain of pataphysics, the which should be pronounced and is more. It's not so much a laugh. It's more of a sort of noise of understanding. But of course, the humour's there because it's spelt So Bostonnage, terribly important for the College de Pataphysique. But then you've got all these other entities that are all around the world now, and then you've got all the people who are involved in pataphysics but aren't members of some organisation, because you don't have to be. There's something paradoxical about having a pataphysical organisation. It kind of doesn't make sense, does it? Why would you have something with laws and statutes and traditions and and a whole kind of archaeology
they have those statutes and traditions only to make fun of them, right? Because they're unobservable, they're stupid, they're positively nonsensical. And in some respects, it's, I don't know, it's the Royal Order of the Water Buffaloes, right? I mean, it's not a real organization. They don't do things.
But the College of Pataphysics, perhaps because it's such an absurd thing, it did have its period of occultation.
Yes.
How did that come about, and what was the purpose, and why did that period end?
Well, oh God,
sorry.
This is where. How long have I got now? I mean, this does get really difficult. So, how did it come about? Well, the head of the college at the time declared a state of occultation. The head of the college was a real person. But the real head of the college is Dr. Faustral, and then the second in command is Bostonnage. So it's the third in command is when you get to a real person. But I think probably what happened was there was a sense that in the college that the things it was trying to do were no longer happening in the way that it wanted them to happen. That it was becoming too well known, too understood. And there was something sort of unpataphysical about its very existence, So it went into occultation, but then proceeded to produce a journal just the same. And there was this idea that the real activities of the college were happening in secret, And then why did it come to an end? Well, because it was agreed that it would come to an end in the year 2000. But then the question was, would this be the year 2000 AD or the year 2000 EP? Because the college had its own calendar.
Yes, another thing we haven't talked about, the pataphysical calendar.
Yeah. So the pataphysical calendar has 13 months that are exactly equal length, and it has an imaginary day that you can substitute in there each month. So there's a lot of argument about that, but eventually it was ruled that it would be 2000 AD. And there was this kind of millennialist tendency, I suppose, in the college, and so it disocculted, and the crocodile became head. And at the same time, there was Baudrillard wrote about this in an essay, The Pataphysics of the Year 2000, and there was this kind of explosion of interest and lots of organisations forming all over the place. And that we arrive at the situation we're in today, where you know, you can join your local pataphysical organization if you know where to look. It's pretty much like that. Yeah. There's one in Melbourne.
Yeah, I haven't paid attention.
You know, this is the thing, isn't it? Do you join these things or not, or do you form on yourself?
I think you're supposed to not join them.
I always, when people ask me, because people do ask me from time to time, you know, can I join or can I form? I just say, yeah, go ahead. And the college, you know, you just pay your subscription and you're a member. I mean, it's as simple as that. But the point is that when the college in the early days, it was quite difficult to join, you know, and there was a whole kind of mysterious aspect to becoming a member of it.
It was an illusion mystery.
Yeah, now it's just simple. You go on a website and you pay your money and that's it. So I mean, it's all good. I mean, you know, I've nothing against any of these organisations really, but to me, pataphysics is a living thing that is spreading through all sorts of areas, and these organisations represent one aspect of it. That's all. Yeah.
Yeah. So on to the last question. You'll be pleased to hear as we run out of time. So the last question is the obvious one. But where are we now with pataphysics? Where's it going?
Well, I've already said it. Quantum computing, I think, and quantum mechanics generally is the area that is most alive with pataphysics now. It won't stay that way because commercial interests will take over, and this is what tends to happen. You know, the deadening effects of when people spot an opportunity will tend to kill off the pataphysics. But right now, we have a real opportunity in the quantum world with pataphysics because the ideas are so aligned, so beautifully aligned. And then in a slightly easier way, you know, it's just a presence, as we've described, really, in so much that is going on in the arts, in science, in life. And so engaging with those ideas, I think that's going to continue. I mean, I get emails every week from people, random people, you know, wanting to talk about pataphysics. I mean, the level of interest in it is astonishing, really, given that, you know, it's kind of very esoteric origins. You know, it has tremendous power as an idea still, and I love that about it. So I think it'll just continue to thrive and have energy. You know, it's got its own perpetual motion built in.
Yeah, Christian, anything to add?
Well, I would just say that in the 21st century, what I foresee occurring, it seems to me burgeoning everywhere we look, a confluence, a renewed renaissance of collaboration between the arts and the sciences. I've argued that certainly in this century, science is undoubtedly going to be the most important cultural activity that human beings do on the planet. I mean, maybe short of the economy. Science is still the most important thing that we do collectively, and the future really depends upon our ability to get it right. It seems to me that, you know, unless we get it right, we might find ourselves, you know, the brink of many catastrophes. And so it's all the more important, right, to get it right in the world of science. And yet somehow, I don't know, certainly among poets, there's a great deal of suspicion still in response to the sciences. I find this a bit bewildering, in part because I think it's very important for literary writers, especially poets, to be in on the ground floor of all of these socio-technological changes. And yet, you know, if I read a poem about the ability to transform an organism by genetically engineering it so that it becomes a living poet itself, right? You know, transforming a bacterium so that it becomes a work of living poetry. Poets get outraged by that, and I just look and say that seriously, that's just a pataphysical response to the circumstances of our current condition. That should be normative. It would be the kind of thing that anybody would do if they were paying attention. And it seems to me that if you're paying attention right now, you're going to end up probably borrowing a lot of tools from the toolkit of pataphysics. You're going to be very interested in the importance of science in the 21st century. You're going to want to think about how to respond adequately to the circumstances of that paradigm. Because if you ignore it, I think we do so at our peril. We've got to be able to contribute to it. Lay people, ordinary people, have to be able to participate within those conversations in a manner which is productive. Pataphysics probably has a role to play in all of that. You know?
Yeah. Good to see you again, Christian. Really pleased to meet you, Andrew, for the first time.
It was so much fun hanging out with you. Thanks for being so smart. We appreciate it.
Oh
Yeah,
and the same to you. It's a deep joy, as they say.
Hopefully you'll come back on the podcast. Perhaps we could talk about your music next time.
Of course, I'd be happy to. And happy to talk more about pataphysics. There's so much more to say.
There really is.
We barely scratched the surface, really. But yeah, thanks very much.